Well, I think the focal point really is on the sources of concern. The Quebec bill is largely designed to increase the amount of available French language content on streaming services and to increase the discoverability of that content. In other words, how easy it is for people to find. In certain respects, I think some of the bill is a solution in search of a problem, but more problematically are some of the real problems that arise out of the bill. There are constitutional related concerns, a real question as to whether or not a federal law that does some of the same things can coexist with a provincial law in this area. And past attempts by the province of Quebec to move into the area of communications regulation has been struck down by the courts as an area that is where the responsibility of the federal government. Now, in the case of internet streaming, there has been for the last little while a bit of a debate as to whether or not internet streaming is in fact broadcasting. And so, in certain respects, if the answer is that internet streaming is broadcasting, then Bill C-11, the Online Streaming Act, which is the federal law, would be constitutional. And it's much harder to make the case that the Quebec bill would be constitutional under those circumstances. If it isn't broadcast, and some have tried to argue that internet streaming is different from conventional broadcast and shouldn't be viewed as broadcasting, well, then the federal law might be unconstitutional and the Quebec law actually might be valid. But we don't really know the answer, and it's possible that that issue on the constitutional side may ultimately go to the courts. But beyond that, and you can obviously jump in with the questions, beyond that, there are, I think, real concerns about the substance of the bill as well, assuming, let's say, that it is constitutional. Yeah, so I think there are two main elements on that front with respect to this bill. There are some others in terms of requiring that when people boot up a service that it's in French in the French language. But the fundamental ones when it comes to content are quota requirements and discoverability requirements. And to be clear, the government hasn't identified precisely what those are going to be. It's punted on some of those issues for future regulations. But I think both of those proposals raise some significant concerns. The issue of quotas in particular, I think, is really problematic. That is something that we do not see in the federal law, and in many ways for good reason. Because if you begin to establish quotas, essentially what percentage of a given library, say on a service like Netflix, meets a certain requirement, in this case that it's French language content, you almost by definition are going to require the removal of certain other kinds of content, right? So a service like Netflix is going to look at this requirement and say, how much French language content do we have? How much can we acquire? And then whatever that percentage is, they're going to have to scale back all their content that isn't in French in order to meet the requirements of the law. So almost by definition, they're going to do one of two things. They're either going to remove English language content and other language content that's already available on the service. They're going to make it worse in effect in order to meet the quota requirements. Or it is certainly possible, given the significant regulatory costs that already exist at the federal law, they may decide that the Quebec market just isn't worth the trouble, and they may block the service altogether from Quebec, saying that it's just not cost effective to service a market where they're facing all these additional increased costs. I think that you could see them just simply decide that anybody with a Quebec-based billing address is just not eligible to use the service, and so essentially make a choice saying that they want a service that works across Canada. They're willing to meet federal legislation in that regard, but being required to meet this additional quota requirements is simply potentially a bridge too far.
Well,
And
no,
Netflix, I think, may well also argue that, especially when it comes to the discoverability of content on that service, this is a solution in search of a problem. I mean, anyone viewing this can boot up their Netflix, and one of the very first things that they are presented with, literally on the very top bar, is choose the language of content that you want to see. And you can choose not only French language content, but French Canadian language content as well, some of which has been dubbed specifically for the Quebec market. And so they've already made efforts to ensure that finding content in French is as simple as clicking a button on that service. The idea that we need the government to regulate that as a requirement seems entirely unnecessary.